Hello, and welcome to another episode of my podcast, The Global Agora. My name is Andrej Matišák, and I work as the deputy head of the foreign desk at the Slovak Derby Pravda, which by the name means truth, and is not the Russian Pravda. The United States has celebrated its 250th anniversary. On July 4th, 1776, the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia adopted the Declaration of Independence. Are American ideals just a political myth? Can the U.S. truly be called an imperialist country? What would the world look like without the U.S.? And what kind of president is Republican Donald Trump? Kirk Dorsey, professor of history at the University of New Hampshire, answers these questions for the Global Agora. Listen to our conversation. If you enjoy what I do, please support me on Ko-fi. You can find the link in the description of this episode. And now, on to the new debate. Kirk, you are a historian. What led you to research American history?
So I went to college to be a biologist. I was going to be an ornithologist, in fact, study birds. And I took history courses as my electives. And in particular, my third year in college, I took the foreign policy classes taught by Walter Lefebvre, a prominent scholar of American foreign policy. And I was just hooked. Then that summer, I worked as a field biologist, and I realized I had to get up at 5 a.m. to be a field biologist. But historians got to work till midnight in the lit up library. So I thought, maybe I'll keep ornithology as a hobby and be a historian instead. And then I was fortunate enough to get into graduate school because I really didn't know much about what I was doing back in 1987. And that led me to wanting to study American foreign policy for a career.
Looking at the historical circumstances, was the foundation of the United States somehow inevitable?
I think at some levels, an independent North American republic was going to happen. Britain did not have the power to control what became the 13 original states. It needed acquiescence. John Lewis Gaddis, in one of his essays, had a great point that empires rarely succeed on the will of the imperial power alone. The colonized have to have some tolerance. And I think at some point there would have been a breakaway. It's also Canada Day, July 1st, to commemorate Canada officially becoming, I guess you'd say, quasi-independent in 1867 to control its domestic affairs and then later its foreign policy. So there would have been some republic. I think the two big questions are, what would the founding moment be? Would it be based on an ideology or on an incident or, collapse of British power? And then what exactly would the boundaries of this breakaway republic be? Would it break into a bunch of smaller states, or would it be one large state, which, as you well know, there were people in the 19th century who thought it was going to be the entire Western Hemisphere. So those questions are still, even for historians, sort of live questions. Why did the United States end up with the boundaries it ended up with?
What would probably look completely different in the world if the United States had not been founded 250 years ago?
I think that the biggest difference would have been British imperial power. And therefore, I think the question is, at what point would the United States have become independent? Let's say that there was some sort of Canadian model where in the middle of the 19th century, presumably the British colonies in North America would have been one big state rather than Canada and the United States. And among other things, imagine 1914, if instead of Canada joining the British in World War I, it was Canada and the United States with all the industrial power and population that would have been in the British Empire. I imagine that's one way to think about a big what if. In fact, you wonder if perhaps the Germans would have thought twice about starting a war with Great Britain if Britain also had all of North America in its ranks like it had India and parts of Africa. So I could imagine that being quite different. I think if we look at the earlier part of the 19th century, the whole question of manifest destiny, would Americans, if, let's say that the British had handled tax and representation problems of the 1770s better and had managed to keep what would become the United States in the British Empire, would there have been such a belief in manifest destiny that it was the right of the United States, for instance, to declare war on Mexico? I think the conquest of the Indian nations would have happened because the British were not opposed to that. And I also think that the idea that the United States has an American colonists, or however we would call them, the British subjects, have some certain rights in the Western Hemisphere would have been muted. But I guess ultimately, I can't imagine the British holdings in North America staying dependent much longer than they did just because of the imbalance. Thomas Paine wrote about this in Common Sense. It was unnatural for a continent to revolve around an island. It ought to be the other way around. And I think probably unlike, say, with India or Palestine, where it waits till the middle of the 20th century, the North American colonies would have found a path to a peaceful breakup, perhaps, earlier. And so maybe that's the other question, like a peaceful breakup versus a military breakup. Imagine if the United States was not founded on life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We hold these truths that all men are created equal. If it was just like a legislative act, like, okay, you're independent now, you go create a country. I mean, I think we see this with Canada, right? Canada's really struggled. What exactly is Canada? What's French? What's First Nations? What does Canada stand for in the world? And for all the flaws of the United States, the Declaration of Independence is a really remarkable document about the place of humans in the world and, the relationship to the divine, but relationship to their leaders. The Constitution, which I think flowed pretty logically from that, again, is a statement of remarkable freedom and liberty. And as much as the United States has failed to live up to that, sometimes it has also proposed those ideas and supported those ideas. Not to get too political, but what we're seeing in the Trump administration is like, yeah, none of those ideas really matter outside the world. And frankly, I think the world is paying for it. Not having American leadership, as flawed as it is.
America's story has often been described as a constant effort to live up to its founding ideals. How do you define these ideals in the modern era? And do you believe that the story of the United States is really also about a deliberate effort to live up to its founding ideals? Or is it a bit of a political myth?
I think that Americans, so right now we are in a very cynical age, and not just in the age of Trump, this is the 21st century, really the late 20th century as well, probably post-Vietnam, post-Watergate for Americans. There's been a lot more cynicism. I think that for most Americans, they do believe that the founding ideals laid out in the Bill of Rights, for instance, laid out also in the preamble of the Constitution and in the Declaration of Independence, that the nation has generally lived up to those ideals. Now, there's a huge debate, just to take a small slice right now, about trans people, right? Should we be extending rights to them, or are they a threat to our, basic moral standings? There's a huge debate right now about what that means. So I do think that generally the arc has been to expand the number of people who are included in those original promises that all men are created equal. And obviously in 1776, that was clearly not the case. But compared to the rest of the world, a lot more men were equal in America in 1783 when the war is over than in most other countries in the world. And so I do think that the United States people have come back to that time and time again, this idea of morality. And I think when you look at the dominant theme of American foreign policy in the 20th century, for instance, we often talk about Wilsonian foreign policy. And we know Wilson was a racist and all the problems of Wilson. But still, in the 14 points, he laid out this idea that there should be free exchange of goods, people should be able to move freely. The right of the governed to have a say in their government was significant. And Wilson really pushed that. Now, we backed away from it before World War II. But then after World War II, the United States really pushed that. And most American leaders from FDR on recognized that we were a stronger nation and a more peaceful nation when we had alliances around the world with countries that were either democracies or moving towards democracies. Now, some of that was hogwash, right? I mean, like Chile in the 1970s and 80s, they didn't really know that Chile was moving towards a democracy, but they were fine with the Pinochet government. But a lot of that was real. And so I do generally think that there has been a uneven but generally steady progress towards this idea that, yes, we try to recognize that all men are created equal. Our foreign policy, more often than most great powers, I would say, has been based on this idea that there are moral values that we have to stand up to and that we actually advance, and they help the United States to advance them. I mean, I think President Obama was actually remarkably good about framing that, which is one of those great ironies. Like, here's a Black man who was often vilified for his race, and then going out in the world and telling the world about the virtues of American foreign policy and what America stood for. And I don't think he did that. I don't think he was lying. I think he recognized that was good for the United States. So I do think the Obama trend is a little stronger than the Trump trend. Trump's had the benefit of running against a couple of weak candidates, and also a lot of people who are bitter about things that, that are hard, that we could spend another hour talking about.
Can the U.S. be described as an imperialistic country in the classical sense of this word?
It can. I think it ebbs and flows, but certainly if we think of an imperialistic country as having a metropole and then going out and conquering other areas that it intends to not treat equally. So obviously the Philippines are an example, but we still own Puerto Rico. And I will admit that I think for most of the 20th century, there's been an uncertainty about what to do, for instance, with Puerto Rico. That Puerto Ricans have had a couple of referenda on whether to pursue statehood or independence or the status quo. And each time it splits roughly in thirds. So even the Puerto Ricans aren't sure whether or not independence or statehood is better. So in the traditional sense of an empire, the United States has certainly had its periods. And certainly the way it's treated Native Americans for most of our history up to sort of the late 20th century as subjugated people who did not have equal rights, who in many cases couldn't even get citizenship. And yet there's a very different kind of empire that the United States has engaged in. I mean, it is pretty remarkable that the vision from 1776, but certainly from the passage of the Northwest Ordinance in the 1780s, was that the United States would expand, it would conquer territories, and then those territories would enter the Union as equal states. And so Utah could enter with the exact same rights as Virginia. That's kind of a remarkable thing. And it really the problem it ran into was the Philippines. And where people said, A, do we really think Filipinos are equal to people from Virginia? And the answer was no, right? So the racism that's always been present in American history. But also, how would we treat the Filipinos in 1900 as part of a representative government based in Washington? Like, how would the Filipino representatives even get to Washington and communicate with their constituents? So I think there's a tension there about empire. And I think that's partially why pretty quickly the U.S. government's position on the Philippines was, can we give this back? Like in 1916, they passed a law saying our goal is to give the Filipinos their independence because managing the Philippines has not been a good idea. And then post-World War II, we have a very different kind of empire, one where the United States builds bases all around the world, but always with the consent of the local government. Now, you could argue those governments are not always speaking the will of the people, but we don't force bases on anybody. And, we've pulled bases out, coming back to the Philippines, right? The United States pulled bases out of the Philippines when the Filipinos clearly didn't want the Filipino government, didn't want the U.S. there. So I think it's an empire, but it's also in the broader scope of things, ultimately, I think it's kind of a unique empire in world history that has built its power as much on building alliances with like-minded countries as much as forcing itself on poorer, weaker people.
Of course, the United States has played a central role in shaping the modern international order. You mentioned a couple of things, but which moments best explain how America became a global power?
To me, it's the Bretton Woods meeting in 1944. And it was that meeting where the United States convened all the allied nations who wanted to attend, and remarkably, the Soviet Union showed up as well, to effectively put rules behind the Atlantic Charter from 1941. Because the Atlantic Charter, which I still think is an amazing document, I teach this to my students. I was like, okay, this was written before the United States was at war and says the ultimate defeat of the Nazi tyranny. Like, we're declaring our war aims. But of course, the other thing that's in the Atlantic Charter that's really remarkable is this idea that after the war, there will be equal access to resources and freedom of the seas for victor and vanquished. Like, we're going to beat these people and then we're going to bring them back into the world system because that's how we're going to get peace. And the Bretton Woods meeting in 1944, which in many ways was more symbolic than significant because things like the World Bank and the IMF took some time to really get going. But it was a statement to the world, certainly to the Allies, that the United States after World War II was not going to go back into an isolationist, we're not joining the Treaty of Versailles, we're not going to participate in European politics, but actually the way to peace is economic cooperation around the world. I mentioned Walter Lefebvre at the beginning, and, I have obvious disagreements with some of Lefebvre's takes, but I think his point about the start of the Cold War is that there were actually two radical revolutionary ideologies at the end of World War II. Obviously communism, but the American economic model was pretty radical and revolutionary for these European empires that were based on sometimes shutting out the United States. But now it's like every country is going to be in this system where we're all going to trade our resources and that's going to bring us prosperity. But the United States said, we are going to be the backstop of that. We're going to set gold at $35 an ounce and our currencies will be fixed convertible. Now, again, there were some hiccups along the way, but this statement that the United States was going to lead and that it negotiated with the British, it didn't tell the British. John Maynard Keynes was drawing up a lot of these plans. The Indians and the Chinese are arguing about how much money to put into the Bretton Woods system because they want to be more respected. this is not the United States telling them this is what we're going to do. Let's get together and work it out. And obviously we have to have a big voice because we're the biggest economy in the world, but we need to negotiate a system that you can all feel comfortable in. To me, that is the most remarkable moment. And even though, Nixon has the Bretton Woods shock in 1971, it still is a statement to the world that after this war, we're going to take the steps to make sure that we will try to broker a peace to keep the world from another one of these, million people plus killings that we've had twice already this century.
What do you consider the brightest and the darkest hour of the United States in its 250-year old history?
I would put Bretton Woods right up there as the brightest, but also it's not so much a moment as the commitment after 1945 to treat Japan and the western half of Germany as societies to be rebuilt rather than societies to be punished. It would have been very easy to extract revenge on both of those. And I think you could even argue in some ways we didn't extract enough revenge in West Germany, right? I mean, the way so many of those Nazi generals came back and are running the Wehrmacht in the 1950s and 60s, Operation Paperclip. Still, I think that was a commitment. I mean, all you have to do is look at West Germany versus East Germany and say, look at what the Soviets did to East Germany. The United States easily could have let the French, strip West Germany. They said, no, that's not good in the long term. And I would also, right up there, I think I would put the 14 points, even though nothing came out of it in the short term, for the world's strongest power to say we reject the idea of conquest and we promote the idea that people, even colonial people, should have a say in their government. That's, to me, just a remarkable statement for a most powerful nation. And so, I often get in debates with people about Woodrow Wilson, like, yeah, Wilson was a racist. We don't like Wilson. It's like, okay, yeah, all true. 14 Points is one of the most remarkable documents in world history, and he authored it himself, even if he didn't live up to it. For America as a whole, obviously slavery is by far our darkest moment and struggles to deal with the legacy of slavery after 1865, the unwillingness to even acknowledge basic rights. And again, this goes back to your earlier question about living up our creed. The fact that we are still having arguments about whether trans people should be allowed to be just left alone, right? I mean, like, can't they just do what they're, and then, that they're being vilified communicates to me that clearly we have not gotten all the way there yet. Even there are people in the United States talking about rolling back gay marriage. Like, how that hurts anybody, I don't know. But, we have these steps back. And so I think it's not just, it's race. When I teach my students about the Tulsa race massacre of 1921, many of them had never heard of it. And the idea that just an entire Black community in Tulsa could just be burned to the ground and 300 people killed, and the country just like we're not even going to respond to it. I think race is by far the darkest. It's a sort of a chapter that runs through. And then I think, connected to that, obviously the dark moment is the secession crisis of 1861, when will this experiment, as Lincoln called it, will this experiment survive? Or are we going to get in a position where the United States will start breaking into smaller collections of republics that are inevitably going to go to war with one another, and then probably we'll lose our liberty in the process? I have more on both sides, but you asked me for just one. I think I gave you like 5 on each side.
You mentioned that your students were not even aware of some events from the American history. So what aspects of America's history deserve greater public recognition, even if they might be controversial or uncomfortable for some?
So I teach the basic American survey from the Civil War to the present. That's for first-year college students. Most of the students who take it are people who need to fulfill a requirement for a history class at the university. And so I get people who've had high school American history, but it's maybe 1 year and it starts in the Revolution or starts in the original founding and gets up to maybe World War II. And they're just like touching pieces along the way. I do think many of my students, because I come from a state that's, to be blunt, very white, like 95% of New Hampshire is white. And most of our students come from New Hampshire, Maine, northern Massachusetts. So we have an overwhelmingly white student body. Conveying to them what racism has meant in the history of the United States, I think a lot of our students think that's a thing in the past. And largely it is, right? There's no more lynching. I mean, there are crimes, obviously, and we tend to prosecute those. But that what a breakthrough, for instance, the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 65, that these changed people's lives in a way 100 years after slavery ended. We were still fighting about that and still struggling with that. And the sad part is that some of that's become controversial. There are some people who consider that woke to be focusing on that in the 1960s. Whereas I think it's a moment we as Americans should be proud of, not that it took 100 years, but that there was a peaceful transfer of power effectively, that the nation recognized the sins of not treating African Americans equally and said, okay, yes, we need to rectify that. And then also there is a sense that the expansion of the United States was probably inherently a good thing and inevitable. Okay, yeah, we treated the Indians poorly, but my students are often just shocked to learn about the Mexican War. Like they sure know there was a war with Mexico, but that Polk basically just lied to them completely, to the country completely about the war. And then, was in it purely to conquer California, which wasn't even on the table in the negotiations. So I think for the people who are maybe on the liberal side, I think they think I'm hopelessly biased because I have a lot of faith in the larger trajectory of the United States. And I don't emphasize, race and all the bad things we've done in the world enough. I emphasize that the United States has done a lot of good things in the world. And for the people on the Trump side, they're like, this was all righteous. And, we were great until you guys got too woke and ruined it. So more than anything, I just want our students to recognize that they need to have a balanced understanding of the United States and that we are humans, we make mistakes, but there is also this set of values that the United States assigned to itself and now has to live up to. And we should go back and look at those values. And then the other thing I really like teaching them is just, you think you got it bad, you go back to 1865 America. When doctors were using leeches and, bloodletting and, their communication was a telegraph if you were lucky, to really understand, even talking about what food that you guys think you're cool eating local. What do you think they did in 1865? They ate local because meat spoiled, So just having them think about how much has changed. Because one thing that really troubles me in the country as a whole is this idea is like, oh man, things are so bad. It's like, you have no idea how good you have it in the 21st century United States. 99.5% of the people who ever lived in the world wish they could trade places with you. And here you are complaining because your cell service isn't that good, to try to give that perspective that they are really fortunate to live when they do and where they do.
You mentioned Trump and, of course, then racism. We have seen how the current administration of President Donald Trump is erasing some historical references to people of color and women and their contributions. How problematic is it?
Huge. It is huge because it's important to remember that at all points in American society, and I bet this applies to other countries as well, there are always the cranks on the outside, like the people in the 1950s or in the John Birch Society, the UN is secretly controlling us, In the age of the smartphone and social media, those people have now found an audience to talk to one another, connect to one another, but then also amplify their message so that people who maybe aren't paying that much attention are hearing it. And then when we have the president amplifying some of that, of course, people who aren't paying a lot of attention to politics are more prone to say, oh, gee, the president said that. And maybe there's something to that. So I don't know. Well, there's a lot of despicable stuff going on. The most shocking thing to me is the way in which the military under Pete Hegseth has really started attacking the whole idea, for instance, of general officers who are Black and sometimes female. The Atlantic, actually, the July issue of the Atlantic has a great article about Black officers and the way in which the Pentagon has de-emphasized some of them and has been discouraging others. And one of the people in that article said it might take 30 or 40 years to rebuild trust with the Black community. And obviously, it's not just about the Black community. It's about telling white people, if you secretly think they're not equal, the president and the Secretary of Defense agree with you. And that emboldens people. And then taking these things down, like taking down the reference to pride at the Stonewall Memorial in New York, that doesn't even make sense. Taking the reference to slaves away from Philadelphia. And, ultimately what it tells me is that these people are weak. Yes, George Washington owned slaves. There were slaves all over the place in 1776. If we are not strong enough as a country to admit that, yes, all men are created equal, but we enslaved all these people at the same time, and this is a paradox we have to figure out, and it took us almost 200 years to figure it out, then it says that we are not really that serious, that we can't even be presented with tough questions and solve them. Trump likes to, put himself in, these really chintzy artists who put Trump with all these other Republican leaders. And when I see the paintings with him and Theodore Roosevelt in the same painting, I'm like, Theodore Roosevelt would actually eviscerate Donald Trump. I think actually, not just with words. This idea that, you should revere the president and you should, you can't talk about the country's history. I think, these are both brash New Yorkers, but one of whom was actually a leader and the other whom was just this sort of guy who, is just a loudmouth. Well, they're both kind of loudmouths, but at least Roosevelt, I think, recognized when he was being a loudmouth that had some humor about himself. So I think this is one of the most troubling things that's happening domestically is that particularly Secretary Hegseth has declared war on what he calls woke, but I think any reasonable person would call just equal treatment. And it's going to damage our military. He already has damaged our military, and it's damaging our faith in the military. It's just one of the many things that we're going to have to spend years trying to clean up. And I don't know how we get over it, but it is a national problem. And I think racism is there. It's present. I have relatives who said things like, they voted for Biden, but couldn't vote for Harris. And I asked one of them why. And said, well, I don't think she's that smart. It's like, she's a senator. She's been attorney general. Donald Trump probably cheated on his SATs. It's not like, like he's a Mensa member. And, so what that, I think at some level, it's probably sexism and racism combined. It's not as open, but when the president and the Secretary of Defense do it openly, it makes it easier for people to openly be racist. This is just a shocking thing that has developed. But I can't say that I'm surprised by it. I mean, I think it was pretty clear that Trump felt that way in his first term and even when he was running for office. I mean, talking to a group of police officers and telling them, when you push them in the car and you duck it, don't pack the guy down, like slam him into the police car. We know who he's talking about. And, complaining about football players kneeling during the national anthem, that they should be attacked when it's black players kneeling. Like, this has been something he's done for his entire career, even before he was president.
So to wrap it up, Kirk, I wanted to ask you if you think that Trump is among the worst American president, as many of his critics claim. You can answer that if you want, but really broaden the scope a bit. Throughout its history, the United States has experienced deep political and social divisions. From a historian perspective, how does today's polarization compare with previous periods of American history?
Yes. Okay. And I will say openly, yes, Trump is the worst president in American history. And if we removed him, Vance would probably be the second worst president in American history. And I'm fully aware of James Buchanan's record and Andrew Johnson's record. And what makes them worse is, well, it's a multitude of sins. First of all, the just obvious and outright corruption. When J.D. Vance said the other day, Watergate today would be a 1 week story. It's true because Trump has something just as bad that comes the next week. And then we forget, we have completely forgotten in this country that we are blowing up boats in the Caribbean and have killed 250 people for no stated reason. I mean, those are war crimes, open and shut war crimes. And we're not even talking about them anymore because he declared this war in Iran that he can't end. So it's just one thing after another. The assault on the democratic system, like the whole question of did I win the 2020 election? And he will not appoint anybody to a position who does not agree that he won the 2020 election. The weaponization of the Justice Department to go after his enemies quite clearly. And I haven't even gotten to the actual foreign policy where he has done so much damage to our alliance with NATO and other alliances as well. And, when the war started with Iran, one of my students wrote to me and said, what do you think? And I said, well, first of all, this was right after the first strike. I said, anything that was good was coming out of this war has already happened. Like getting rid of the leadership of Iran, those people, not going to shed any tears for those leaders. But that's it. Nothing good's coming out of this war. And the only people who are really smiling right now are Putin and Xi. Right? They're like, great, we just tied up the United States in this completely stupid war. And, if the Iranians had closed the Straits of Hormuz on their own, the world would have rallied to the United States to open them. But we closed the Straits of Hormuz. And the world's like, that's your problem. You solve it now. You're like, and I don't blame the Europeans. They should tell us it's our problem to solve because we created it. In terms of how dark this is, I think it is comparable to 1861. 1861, the main difference was that there was a regional split between North and South over slavery. So it was very clear how the country would break. And I think because this is not quite as regional, I don't think we're going to break into some sort of armed conflict. Although I really would not put it past Trump to really mess with the 26 and 28 elections in a way that creates the possibility of some sort of insurrection. But in terms of the division in the country, it's remarkable. I was in Columbus, as I mentioned to you, Columbus, like Central Ohio, which is a red state. I went down to the rural part of the state where I spent a lot of time as a kid. And, everybody's perfectly friendly. I'm betting that if I had had a Harris t-shirt, it would have been a lot different, at least in the rural part. And so, on one hand, there is this civility that continues. And I think we've seen this with some of the World Cup fans, right? Who come over here, they see the news and I think we're a bunch of racists who are deporting everybody. And I mean, I didn't even put that on my list of sins of the nation. And that's way up there. And yet they meet average Americans and find out that average Americans are perfectly nice people who will like, hey, let's go to Buc-ee's and, find out this huge gas station. Let's go to Fred's barbecue. And so there's that tension. Like, how do these Americans who are in so many ways, so perfectly nice to each other and then go and vote for a guy who basically says half the country is scum? So I think that we are in a constitutional crisis. It is going to become really evident in November when Trump does everything he can to hold both houses of Congress in his power. I think we're already there. This is why the Supreme Court rulings are so significant. But I do think that the November elections, that's where we're going to find out how much Trump's willing to do to hang on to power. And I think he will do pretty much anything to hang on to power. The latest book by Maggie Haberman and Jonathan Swan, basically the conclusion is, why did he run again? To stay out of jail. And I think he recognizes that if the Democrats get control of Congress and the House, they will investigate him. And I should step back and say, for all my life, I was a Republican. I voted for John McCain. I voted for George H.W. Bush. I voted for Ronald Reagan. And then this guy comes along and is like, okay, I cannot be part of this anymore. But I, stayed in the party partially to vote against him in the primaries. But it's amazing to me how he has completely changed the party from what it used to be. So now I'm in that group of what's left of the McCain Republican wing. We're all Democrats now, basically, because it's the only party that actually believes in free elections. So I think in November of 26, we will come as close to 1861 as we've ever come. So it's that dark.
This was another episode of my podcast, The Global Agora. Subscribe and listen on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other platforms. If you enjoy what I do, please support me on Ko-fi. The link is in the episode description. Thank you for listening and stay tuned.